Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a new virtual DDD, the first of 2021, which hopefully will be a better year. Today, we're going to talk about dissecting and splitting system towards bounded context and microservices. And we're going to do a small introduction round because with me are Rebecca, Chris, Alberto, Trond, and Christina. And yeah, Rebecca, a short introduction to start with you. You're first on my screen.
Oh, okay. Hi. Yeah, modularity is not a new problem. And I guess I want to say that from my background, writing books about object design, starting in the 90s, understanding boundaries and contractual relationships between systems and subsystems has been a problem that we've been wrestling with for a long time. And so from my background, I bring together design knowledge that, yeah, we're doing things with new technology, but we've still had distribution and communication and data coupling and boundary issues for as long as I've been doing software. So that's my intro.
Great, thanks. Chris, you're up next on my screen.
Yeah, hi, I'm Chris Richardson. I mean, I want to echo what Rebecca says, right? I mean, I feel like kind of one of the essential things that we as software developers do is sort of some form of divide and conquer, right? Splitting systems up into pieces. And the sort of the pieces, we might give them different names, but it's sort of, I feel like some of the issues remain the same. I mean, it reminds me, like, I think the first paper on like modularity was like 1973, right? What was fascinating is I feel like I read a paper that was preceded that, and they were thinking, well, these things, and we think they're kind of cool modules, or we're not really sure what they are or what they do. And then if you fast forward, 40 years or more, you see the same thing sort of around microservices, right? We're not sure what they are, but we're dividing them up and they need to interact. And so many of the same issues are just kind of occur at these different levels of granularity, I think. And yeah, and my long-term interest is like sort of been object-oriented design in a sense, right? And DDD is the sort of the latest incarnation of that. And it's same stuff, just different levels of granularity.
Great, thanks. Nice introduction, already starting great. Alberto, you're up next on my screen.
Okay, this is on my side. Well, been coding since 37 years now, but what I do mostly is putting stickers on a wall, now on mirror boards. I'm hope to get back to the wall soon, and this is giving me a different perspective about how to chop systems, because I see things in a different way. I mean, literally, I see colors, I see space, and it's just giving me something that could attack the same problem from a different angle.
Great, thanks. Trond.
Yes, Trond from Oslo, snowy Oslo here. Yes. I have actually, modularity is actually older than I am. So I'm not saying that I'm young, I have a gray beard, but I've been around a few years, but 20 odd years or something doing programming. And I work mainly in large backend systems, typically classically layered, like a big monolith in the backend. So I've been stuck in monoliths for years. And we always struggle with that modularity because we have already usually you just use layers, right? That's what I'm brought up on, doing layers and strict rules on going down and all that stuff. But then at some point we wanted to split this monoliths up, and then we started getting into how should we do this? And then, of course, some bright people pointed back to that paper from, I think it was 72, Parna's paper, by the way. So we started reading that and getting some grip, and then came across Eric Evans' book and thought, oh, this is brilliant. He talks about this in this book. Let's do this. And followed the patterns and went into a proper rut. It didn't help us then, at least. So I feel like we're still, as you said, Chris, we're still struggling with this, even though that many years since, 40 plus years since. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to learning stuff from all the people here. I'm actually doing a talk, writing a talk at the moment on modularity, so I can maybe pick up some points.
Yeah. Great, thanks. And last but not least, Christina.
Everything what you said, what all of you, with an additional ingredient, which I don't know, it wasn't there, it wasn't in the papers 20 years ago or 30 years ago, but we have it all the time now, the human ingredient, teams, people, thinking, feeling, being against. We cannot make a great job if we don't include this aspect too, and this is I think has a big correlation to the bounded context and what we want to do and what we need to do.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Software developers are people.
And we are done with this talk.
Oh, that was quick. We solved it. Yeah.
Great closing.
And so are product owners. Yeah.
Okay, okay, but only because of you.
No, but I would say that, you know, like we've always for a long time, we recognize that users are people and product owners are people, but you could sort of say that the fact that the idea that software is built by people, which actually then impacts architecture, right, is maybe that's somewhat a late arrival, right?
We needed Alberto to put it on the wall and say it is your idea, but it's my code, which is going online.
Well, I mean, I mean, you know, because I sort of, my big area of interest is microservices, right? And to me, like, you know, key motivation there is to divide a system up into team-sized chunks in a way that enables the teams to work in isolation, you know, most of the time, right, in terms of developing, testing, and you could say also scaling separately, right? And, you know, so it's the human factor, the need for, well, in a sense, loosely coupled teams. You could say that Conway's law is kind of an ancient thing too, but you could say, I don't know, maybe SOA, which was services, kind of didn't really take that into account, whereas microservices is architecture meets Conway's law big time.
Yeah.
So
another great closing.
Yeah, but if I hear you right, it's modularity is already, well, that was 73. I think Conway was 63, 64, something like that. So modularity has been here for a while. I heard Alberto I remember Alberto, you were saying in the past that you never saw the good thing about a bounded context, because within a monolith, if you code correctly, you can have a good modular system in a monolith as well. So you didn't see the real, I'm not sure if I'm quoting you correctly, right? But if I remember correctly,
actually, I don't remember the conversation exactly. But no, one way the thing about bounded context was the thing that was clicking on me and made me jump into domain-driven design, because by reading the book, I just got it like more sophisticated, object-oriented, and then I got the bounded context, and then, okay, this is making a difference. That was the game changer. The thing for me about bounded context and the monolith is I really try to separate the conceptual separation of language, of models, and the physical separation. What I don't want to do is paying the price for physical separation, and we have put an XML in between, or the physical decoupling too early. This is just like this is just a little irreversible choice. You pay it when you feel that you actually need it. But inside my company, we are working on something which is deployed as a monolith, and it has a very, very clean separation between bounded context. We just didn't start the physical decomposition because it didn't make sense. We have such a small team and not so many workload complexity. I mean, there is complexity, but not enough to pay the price for physical separation. We just do one single deployment and we are happy. We're a small organization.
But I think this is changing a lot since cloud services, because earlier you had an ops team which are saying, okay, next server will come in 6 months. Please don't push earlier. I cannot give you more developer space or servers or databases. This has changed totally in the last 5 years, 6 years in my life, 5 or 6 years, and it enabled us to run faster as teams. So we wanted to separate, to be able to deploy, to be able to put our features in production, and this was needed to be separated. I am the same opinion like you, Alberto. I am sure that a monolith can be built with the discipline very good, similarly good. Like it doesn't have to be a microservice. You can make it both very wrong.
But actually, I would like to take it out from the table 2 ways. One, I just don't want to be cornered in a conversation I didn't remember from 2 years ago, maybe more. So, yeah. Okay. So please, let's start from what I remember I said, not from this. But the second is there is a coordinate that both you and Chris mentioned, which is actually really important here, which is the size of your development team. I'm talking about the team size of 1.5 person, and I am the half. And so
okay,
big separation doesn't make any sense. While if you have just already 10 people, you probably would like to split in teams. And Chris mentioned you want to work in isolation. So this is actually completely in the human space. You would like to have less meetings, less coordination, less need to be synchronized with another group of people working now probably in a different city. And this is a price to pay. It's mostly in conversation and coordination, which is something that usually is not really observed because it cannot be counted that easily. But the number of teams and the number of people is making a big difference in the organization in terms of which architectures are more viable. And
I mean, like in theory, or in fact, you can have a modular monolith, right? I mean, maybe our programming languages don't provide sufficiently powerful enough mechanisms to enforce modularity, right? So that, which is sort of a separate issue. But if you are disciplined, you can build a modular monolithic system. But what's interesting is if you look at the needs of modern software development, right, which is all about rapid and frequent and reliable delivery of software, which is, I'm going to push it to the extreme, but it's like every developer commits changes once a day. Those changes are automatically built and tested and deployed into production, right? I mean, that's how sort of high-performing organizations ship software, right? Amazon's deploying every 0.6 seconds or something like that, right? If you've got a large code base, at some point, and you have so many developers, right? You even have contention for commits on a mono repo, right? And then your build pipeline ends up becoming a bottleneck, right? So, like if it's 100 developers a day and it's an 8-hour work day, you can do the math in terms of how many builds you need to get done a day, right? Or how frequent your commits are and so on. So there are, so there's sort of this, you can have, a logically modular system, but the physical monolithic aspect of it ends up becoming a bottleneck at a certain kind of team size and commit frequency.
So commit frequency, team sizes are characteristics when you do want to split up to smaller services to get more into that,
you
Daniel Pink way, autonomy.
Building a Java Sorry, you could have separate teams building a jar file that all goes into a bigger monolith, but at some point, I think you start getting contention and bottlenecks.
Yeah, it's Dave Farley says you just get the full feedback once it all accepted, tested in a production-like system. And if you merge everything up until the point everything is merged and tested, then you know for sure it will be working. So that's late feedback, if you know what I mean. So isolated pipelines is a lot faster feedback for the teams.
I mean, one other thing I wanted to throw up though is if you take kind of step back, right, and we're talking about bounded context, right, whatever that means, that's a whole other discussion because we're not going to get into definitions, right? That's the primary motivation for that is a linguistic one, right? Like dividing things up according to sort of linguistic boundaries so that to keep meanings clear. So one of the interesting things is that kind of from a pure DDD perspective, there's the linguistic boundary thing. But then up until now, what we've been talking about is the mechanics of building and testing and deploying software, which is sort of a different thing entirely.
Well, so I'm going to make a point about linguistics in that linguistic boundaries also serve as ways of understanding behavioral boundaries where functionality matches the terminology that you want. And so it isn't just linguistics, it's also a behavioral, a nod to cohesive behavior and terminology driving that behavior.
Yeah.
So it isn't just how we speak, because if you did that, you could, if we all spoke Esperanto, then we'd have huge systems. But in fact, it is about business functionality where we do talk differently, have our dialects.
Well, yeah, there's the notion of subdomains, right, which sort of represent different functional areas of the business. Not that I'm getting into definitions, right?
Right, yeah.
But which interestingly sort of imply those seem to kind of like have models which are wrapped in bounded context, which are not, but then at the same, which is sort of different from bounded context being linguistic boundaries, yet that's the one big motivation for bounded context, right?
Well, it is one big motivation, but the other thing is, and I'm going to say, coming from, where we had to invent subsystems before, using whatever mechanisms we did in order to do that, that in IT systems, there is this messiness of language. So the fact that I may be using something in a particular way, I may have my ways of talking about it that are different than other people that are business stakeholders using applications. So there isn't, it's not all clean. It is a messy process of sorting this out. Functionality that's cohesive and supports the users of it is essentially what you're trying to get at. But then the question I have is, what happens when it gets really large, right? That you can't reduce it to something that's a big functionality. Is that still appropriate to keep it as one monolith? Probably not. And that's where I think you get into the subdomains or sub areas. But still, it's kind of a messy process.
I think there's something interesting in here. One thing is, it is a linguistic thing by definition, but language is probably a proxy for purpose. Mm-hmm. So the thing for me is the language is really revealing. It's the most observable thing, which might be the result of many factors like team volatility, organization mergers, and then the legacy software too, and many other things. But the real idea is to have models which are tailored around a specific purpose. But investigating purpose, you get messed up definition like our purpose is to manage our business. Okay, let's make a big ball of mud. and then it really doesn't work. But the idea is about, yeah, a model which is specialized around a specific function. The language is the observable proxy to get there. This is what we would like to have, independent models which are cooperating in the best possible way. And but the language is also tricky because there's exactly this type of dynamic. If a group is starting to work on a single purpose, their first model is going to be probably really, really right. The moment you start adding more things, you get more ambiguity. What you do is try to flatten out this ambiguity, adding more precise names on the boundaries, adding composite names, and flattening out the space so that you don't make a mess with the new concept, but you probably already passed the boundaries of the original purpose. Just, I don't know how to describe exactly. Flattening out is a perfect word, but you're trying not to mix up things if you're staying in the same room. And probably when you realize you're doing this, you just expanded the space of your original model too much.
So it's a very organic process with pruning and getting too big and then chopping things up again and then adding more functionality. It's not predictable. Yeah.
Yep.
So does the current architecture, the current logical systems, like let's say, yeah, we were getting into the logical, the mechanical stuff already in the microservices. Does that get in the way of really defining our bounded context or not? Because we're thinking too much in the current way of our software. And I'm not just saying IT people.
You're not actually saying anything.
You broke up, Kenny.
Sorry. Yeah. No. Yeah, I see my router is next to me, so that's weird. But I'm gonna check if I can do something about it.
You should starting it. Your router.
Yeah, my phone. No, so do you know what I'm getting at? So is the current system getting in the way of discovery? Like,
well, I kind of feel like there's this really interesting thing. Like, if you were to sort of, I want to say, do some modeling with some business people, right? I mean, you'd get one answer. Whereas if you then looked at the problem from, oh, you need to go build this thing, right? Which instantly we get into the technical team-oriented concerns we talked about at the beginning. Suddenly you might have, so the business people might come up with this bigger model, right? But then we would want to split it, if we're building it, we want to split it up into team-sized models, right? And then plus there's a sort of other technical concerns that we could talk about later. But even that simple idea that it needs to consist of team-sized chunks means that you've got, like the problem space model might map into multiple solution space models, even though Nick, who's not here, would argue against the use of the term problem and solution space, right? But, which is an interesting kind of concept, really.
In chat is just a discussion about cognitive load, and I think this extends your model, Chris, because team size means how much can the team own and maintain and be responsible for it, and this is a limit of cognitive load regarding to the business, regarding to development, to infrastructure, to a lot of things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you want to have these small teams, right? I mean, I'm just quoting Team Topologies here, which the most amazing book just summarizes a good bunch of ideas, right? Teams, in order to be productive, teams need to be smallish, right? Whatever, 5 to 9 people. Humans only have a certain amount of cognitive capacity, and then the domain that they're working in has a certain amount of cognitive load, complexity, and so that limits how much that team can deal with, right?
Yeah.
And then, yeah, I mean, those are the sort of, I mean, kind of like, that's what I mean by team-sized chunks.
Should we start with the first question?
Yeah, yeah, because that goes in. So let's say you have this. So let's say you have this cognitive load, right? One of the question here that goes in. So for splitting an existing monolith, should we start with data or app splitting? What are some of the trade-off and how does one thread the path between the two? So if you want to split that existing monolith, should we start with data or app splitting?
No.
No,
Exactly.
no,
No.
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 Yeah, I thought that was a
Short answer.
so why no?
Yeah, I can have a little go because that's sort of what we tried when we initially tried to split that monolith, as I mentioned. Not necessarily look at the data, but it was basically the data. It was entities, but they were copies of sort of the entities, tables, entities in the database. And then you get into this. What I've learned later, though, is that's actually regarded as a service-oriented antipattern, like the entity service antipattern. And we felt that heavily because we sort of created, okay, we had a customer service, we had a subscription service, we had an account service, and everything was tied together anyway, because like in this domain, subscription was really central. So you saw that everywhere. So it was like the complete God object, and using that as a way to split your monolith would be catastrophic. I think.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that you say, what do you start with first? And if you have a bunch of crappy, entangled, poorly designed databases, and you have a bunch of unentangled, poorly modularized monoliths, I would start where I would start small. And I would start with something that I feel like it's important to isolate because there's potential, like maybe this is a new area we want to add functionality and it really sucks to do that right now. So in some sense, it's really understanding the topology and the connectedness and the dependencies and where your functionality is trying to go first before you pick any sort of approach. And this year at the Patterns Conference, Joe Yoder and Paolo Merson wrote a paper about the strangler pattern as applied to, different sequences for applying it with a set of patterns for applying it to creating microservices. That's just, I think there are multiple sequences of steps to take based on where the pain is and what you're really trying to achieve. So I'm going to drop a link into for their paper just so that people do it. But it's not just like, what do I start with first? It's like, why do you need to make this change anyway? Don't just do it because it's fun.
I mean, I gave a talk. Actually, there's two flavors of the talk. There's a shorter one, 6 principles of refactoring the microservices, and then the longer one, which is 10 principles. And it basically, some of the principles correspond to exactly what you said there, right? So, I mean, I think sort of the end state where you want to end up is, so what is a service, right? Well, a service is kind of like a class. It's a bundle of behavior and data, right? And so when you actually take legacy code and extract it into a service, you should be moving data and code, right? I mean, I think that's the key thing. Cheating and only moving the code isn't going to give you the full benefits of the microservice architecture. So that's sort of one of the technical points. I mean, I think overall in terms of a strategy is you want to brainstorm what your ideal target architecture is, right? So given my requirements, what is the ideal architecture for my system, right? And you want to refactor towards that rather than going, well, what do I have right now? And then just kind of cobble something together. And then also the order within which you do the refactoring should be based on what I would call a return on investment. So, if you've got to carve off a chunk of functionality is going to require investment in terms of time, because you have to detangle it from everything, which is horrible and painful. And so it should really give you maximum benefit, right? Like it solves a business problem. Like, oh, this is a part of, I suppose you could say this is a key algorithm in our core domain that gives us competitive advantage. And by extracting it out into a service, I can develop and test and deploy it an order of magnitude faster than when it's embedded inside the monolith, right? So there's a big win to the business there. So that's sort of, hopefully this is consistent with what Joe Yoda said, right? In terms of where the ordering, but it's like, what gives you the biggest business value first should be what's driving your migration.
And it isn't necessarily that I want to pick off the easiest thing to do, but sometimes it might be. I'm going to say it depends on what you're trying to achieve. If I'm business advantage with high risks, if I can perform small experiments, and I think that's some of the patterns that they talk about too.
Yeah.
Get me ready to do certain things better. So take the riskiest thing first and go for it. Maybe not. But there's all kinds of things to balance there, in the sense that why would I factor something out unless it has some value, right? And it's going to change. If it's not going to change, leave it in that damn monolith, right? And I say change, like it needs to scale, it needs to be deployed, it's going to be used more free, whatever. So you have to be kind of both experimental and understand your risk tolerance as well.
Yep.
Yeah. No, so the question there is, if we look at DDD, core, supportive, and generic, would you start then maybe with a supportive domain as a heuristic? And not
depends on how scared I was about making any sort of change. I mean, one of the questions that's on the Miro board was what happens when my organization reorgs every year. It's like, I'd say, oh, the last thing to do is take the most riskiest thing.
Let's get into that after I think Trond and Alberto wanted to say something. Alberto and then Trond.
Okay, no, the thing about starting from data. So I totally agree on pick the most valuable refactoring first. And this is exactly where it might be risky or not, but start from the most interesting value. It's not about turning the architecture into microservices. It's about the business purpose, and then microservices are a tool in this direction. But the thing about starting from data is also really, really tricky, because I mean, if you need to transform your architecture into something different, maybe there is a reason, maybe there is probably a business need that you can fulfill. So you have to change something. The moment you start from the data, this is probably the first thing that has been designed on the original system 25, 30 years ago. And so this is probably the thing that you badly need to change. And instead you're saying, like, we're going to keep it this exactly as it used to be, despite all the needs for change, and we're building a new shiny wrapper around it. This is the most expensive mistake that you can do with this architecture. And you're starting exactly by shooting yourself in the foot. So I said no. I try to motivate my no, because you can make many mistakes, but this is the most dangerous one. And you're starting from this and you're not discussing anything about the legacy. Why are you changing the legacy if you don't want to change it? End of my burst. Sorry.
Trond, you were raising your hand earlier. And
I could say word to that. Alberto, it's exactly what I was thinking earlier. But I want to go back to the data though a little, because there is something that you can use the data for. Not copying the existing structure, but look for which fields change together, for example, in an entity, in a table or something. What field in that table changes together with that field in another table all the time? And then start looking into that and maybe use that as a hint to what your new object should be. So back to what you said, Chris, I agree that it is services are like objects with the behavior and data, but it's not any behavior and any data. So you often need more guidance than just pulling out class, for example, from a system monolith. That's what we did, and that was catastrophic, as I said.
And I think Paul Rayner goes into that connaissance, right? And then it's connaissance of data in this case. Yeah. So before we move on to the next question, I have one more diaring question here. And let's say let's say you have the big ball of mud, right? Your monolith. If you split it up if you want to split it up because of that business value, but you're just splitting it up as it is now without knowing that you have to correct models, how dangerous is that? Should you still split to logical systems so that teams would get autonomy, or would you first change your models in your monolith and then split it up? Right? Do you know what I'm getting at?
Why do you think that the teams would get autonomy if they own together a behavior?
Mm-hmm.
If I don't think about behaviors, about processes, about life cycles, then I won't have an autonomy even if I sit in different offices. It will be still coupled because the business drives the autonomy. The business says, the domain says, this is your job and this is their job. And if I don't look at the business and decide based on this domain behavior, then I just will have a mess. And a lot of communication needs and shooting on the foot of the others, but I won't have autonomy. It's not only...
Yeah, so correct, restrict this team cognitive load, but also look for...
It won't happen because the behavior are together. If I don't split on the boundaries on the themes of the behavior or on different behaviors, then I will be coupled. Just that I don't see it anymore, but I still have this coupling.
And do you think, well, it's what I see a lot of times, is that one of the biggest reasons, maybe it's a suggested one, but that's what I usually see where it goes wrong. People are just splitting up instead of looking at the connaissance or autonomy.
This was my no about the question before, because no, you have to look at the behavior, and the data is very important, and it's the only thing what you get only once. And you can use it for transactions, for boundaries, to find transactional boundaries. But in the app is another thing which is built and created, but it doesn't help. But the behavior is saying what can be split and what not, or where can I have these boundaries.
Yeah. So
there's like two different dimensions to this, right? I mean, there's orthogonal things. There's behavior or like operations which act on data, and then there's the data themselves, and how you slice things up is very much it depends on the nature, right? And because it's sort of like it's like there's reasons to split, but then the data ends up being a reason to not split, or at least like if two items of data are, say, within the same thing, monolith or service, then they can be updated atomically, whereas if they're split across multiple services, then they can only be updated using eventual consistency.
Yeah. This is this talk from Odi Dahan, I think, transactional boundaries. Find your service boundaries by transaction, looking at the transaction and asking yourself, must this transaction be a transaction? If the answer is yes, third time it's still yes, then okay, you know this data and this behavior and this transaction belongs together. But maybe we are too we don't ask often enough.
Yeah, maybe we should ask it also more in a behavioral way, right?
Yeah.
Because it has a business impact. It's not about the data, but can this and this be inconsistent for well, you cannot never say how long, but can these two pieces be inconsistent for a short while or maybe a longer while?
Yeah, and the question is, and if the answer is no, they cannot, why not? What happens? And what happens if I have a notification or I give you some opportunities, some choices, and most of the time the answer is okay, I can live with that.
Yeah, well, I think I've had
Chris,
I had a discussion with a particular client, which was like, we must have ACID at all times, right? Which is then, well, that means you must have a monolith, right? Which then means you must develop really slowly, right? Or, you know, assuming there's a large complex system, right? Which means that you're going to struggle to compete in the market. So do you want to be competitive, or do you want to be consistent? Pick,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And you know, and clearly, I mean, the other thing is clearly you can have large organizations with eventually consistent systems, right? Because I mean, there's successful examples just out there. But, you know, obviously the details matter is where exactly you draw boundaries. But, you know, when you have companies that are sitting on top of NoSQL databases like Amazon, right? It's like clearly they're successful.
Sometimes it's not even about eventual consistency. I mean, if I can say one pattern that I see repeatedly as the reason for coupling between teams is the missing separation between a draft and executable model. Just the contract before signature and after signature, same data, different behavior. This is a pattern that I see happening over and over. It might not be a problem of speed, but still is coupling between different teams and also different parts of the organization, just because you implemented the state transition with the flag and kept the same data. And this is all over the place, and is rooted into a misinterpretation of the dry principle, and looks like if you do this, then it's duplication, and you want to get into a new architecture without changing this. And I mean, that is the most common thing that I see all over the place. Well, maybe I don't have customers so many interested in the performances, but in the modeling coupling, yes, that's the biggest problem that I see. The most frequent.
I've seen that one being solved in the pipeline, where they use acceptance for draft and production for execution. Not sure if you've seen that before. Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of companies are centered around a few key business entities, right? You know, I mean, I'm being really naive here, but it's like, to me, banks are customers and accounts. E-commerce is customers and orders, right? I mean, one of my clients, even I can't really say what it is, but it was like entity name Inc. And they were literally all about a given entity, right? Which went through a complex kind of a pipeline, and it was like, yeah, you know, you can split it up, and there seems to be a bit of duplication in a sense, but the different phases seemed sufficiently complex and different that to me it was it wasn't a reason to have a monolith.
Is that the because this is what I see a lot in companies, that the data-driven design is easier than model-driven design, because in a model-driven design.
What do you mean by easier? Easier to create these dependencies?
Easier to reason about, because data is physically presented in a store where you say that is the customer, and they want one representative of the customer, so that's there. Every time you start talking about splitting up data, and then they say, well, how can I get my one one true master data table. That's the
well, and
thing you
then
always get
also,
back from business.
so they're probably also assuming that there's a real life cycle for this data. If you have entities, that it goes through a set of phases, as Chris might have said. But in the real world of business messiness and mistakes and whatever, that's kind of another myth that we like to do. I mean, they're always compensating transactions, and so I think sometimes abstract data models are the scourge of really splitting things up. On the other hand, complexity of data should not be underestimated. So, I mean,
Yeah.
there are rules associated with perhaps doing compensating behaviors and transactions. So you can't just totally split things up, but you don't necessarily want to be locked into this rigidity of, this horribly interdependent pipeline, and nobody can write one line of code without, recompiling the universe.
Let's say culturally, enterprises are very database centric, right? Like data is the crown jewels. Applications come and go. Data must be protected from applications, and so culturally, the primary quote modeling concept is a database schema.
Yes, and usually relational still today.
Yes.
So if that's culturally the way which I agree to, Chris, and domain-driven design is about model-driven design, which is like your model is central. How would you transition to that? Is that the thing that most people are struggling with in the big enterprise large-scale systems? Do you think?
No, they just use an entity framework and it's translated.
Oh, entity.
It was sarcasm, deepest sarcasm ever.
Yeah.
Well, this comes up in the context I have around microservices, which to me, which is not even, models are so yesterday, right? I mean, it's APIs. That's what matters.
Functions.
Right? Yeah, that's a new crown jewel.
Yeah, it's the API, which though in reality, an API basically implies a model, well, sort of a model anyway, right? But all that matters is the API and the you could say the internals and the data, and certainly the database schema. I mean, the database schema is very much an implementation detail, right? Which is a great conversation to have with enterprise data modelers.
In the QA section, we have a.
Happen in this way, but yeah.
Say that again.
I'm not sure this conversation is going to happen in the way you were putting, but.
So let's move on to that question we were
in the QA session, in the QA part. It's fitting.
No. So it was about, so if you divide more towards a modular or bounded context or microservices, but how do you do that when the organization is volatile, meaning big reorganizations every year? So should you go smaller when you have businesses? Did you ever see that work? Big reorganizations, and now we have all these smaller systems. Is it actually a positive thing to have smaller systems with big reorganizations, or will the cognitive load even raise more?
I have one anecdote there. It's not a big enterprise per se, but they had split it up, these monoliths, at least large chunks of it, and then they got huge reorg based on domain-driven design actually, and that worked surprisingly well because they had small components that they could sort of agree on who should own. Right, they put them on. It's okay. This feels like this belongs to that team or that team, and if there's contention, okay, let's split it. Let's let you take some parts and I take some parts. So it's the inverse conveyor maneuver thing, and I think that actually worked quite well for them. But again, they weren't large.
This came up in a panel I was on at Scale by the Bay back in November, I think it was, where someone said, well, you can't architect on your organizational structure, right? And part of it was for this very reason, which is we keep changing, right? But you know, I think that gets into one of the sort of the decomposition patterns, which in a way I think is kind of subdomains, right? I mean, there's an essence of how a business within a particular domain works, right? Which is actually quite long-lived and quite stable, regardless of the particular choice of organizational structure, right? And specifically, like in the realm of business architecture, there's a notion of a business capability, right? And there, I mean, the theme there is pretty much businesses, and all businesses in a given vertical work in kind of the same way, right? So banks work in the same way, all airlines work in the same way, all insurance companies, right? And they just have these underlying sort of stable kind of value streams and core entities that are somewhat timeless.
Timeless, complex, and when you have these reorganizations, which usually is when, as a consultant, I get involved, right? They're trying to streamline one or particular aspect or another of their business, and they keep thrashing. So if I refactor things along a certain line for a particular year, then someone will come along the next year, the new CTO, and will say, oh, that was crappy. We didn't like to do it that way. I want to bring in my guys and do it this way. So I hate to be a little cynical about if you're in a volatile organization, my advice is hunker down, make things small, preserve the functionality you have, but don't do anything radical. It's not worth it.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I see this as a fantastic opportunity. So if you are in a company that does reorganization every year, it means somebody else is paying for your mistakes in finding bounded context. The arena selection paid by somebody else, fantastic, amazing. But at the same time, this is providing a great opportunity because it gives you the perspective to separate the organizational structure from the purpose of the models. I was in a similar place. It was actually was something slightly different. Two national branches of the same multinational company that had ideally the same process, but the organizational structure was very different in different nations. So in one nation, a large office, many responsibility, we need one model for all of this. Another nation, different offices with different responsibilities on the process, while the models should be separated. Well, no, just let's find a way around the purposes of the different model, and maybe we need an aggregated view for a single department where you can see model A, B, and C without a clean separation on the UX, but different functionalities. It was really interesting because the underlying theme that was emerging was the purpose, getting rid of the organizational structure. You still need the same purpose in the organization most of the time. It's just about which department fulfills this purpose in the organization. This changes, but not the model, not that much. Just it's a matter of authorizations and making it accessible in the user interface in a different way. But the underlying model turned out, wow, that's actually really, really similar.
So you were lucky in that case that the model was stable, the organization was not. I've also been involved in situations or got to look into situations where reorganizations were trying to bash together disparate models and say, oh, there really is one here. And I think that's a different kind of situation.
I've seen it as well, where on higher end they say everything needs to be generic, right? All the processes
okay, no
needs to be. We need to cut money, so just make it generic now. And I was in the room doing DDD and say, well, these two things are clearly other purposes. Yeah, right. But our management says we need to do it
We want to unify things. Yeah, that tendency.
Yeah.
I've seen that. So it's sort of like ignoring the perception of the business reorg is that if we just streamline things, then all these little details that have happened to cause things to vary would go away. And maybe
That's
that's what,
simple. You have a model with a thing entity that's got a hash map of name value pairs.
there you go.
Right? That's the universal model.
It's called thing. Yeah.
Was that coming from the enterprise data architect?
No. Well, actually, no. You know, now that you say, I mean, I was just making a total joke, but I think I have encountered that from time to time, which is like, oh, we can't commit to a particular model, so we will have
The generic. Oh yeah.
generic thing. Yeah, and it's like, it just creates. And I think there's a whole bunch of enterprisey SaaS vendors that are basically fundamentally.
Why can't we just have customer, right? For example, yeah, customer, right, or account. They're all the same.
I think we are going not towards DDD now.
Well, I think it's a bit in essence. So I think so. Is there a way? So the way of dividing towards a bounded context when the structure of the organization evolves, well, it can happen. But what are the things we need to look out for when it goes astray? Like, Alberto, you have a good finding, but when does it go astray? What are the signs when you say, well, maybe we shouldn't split this up?
No. What I was saying is just still the biggest indicator is the purpose for a given model. And purposes have not changed that frequently inside the organization. Roles and assignment and department structure, yes, they do. It's just the underlying thing that it is different. But there's a force driving towards. Well, I mean, it might be business capability, but it actually blows down to, I need to talk with the smaller numbers of people in order to deliver something. So I'm talking with this department. They have clear goals, at least for me, and I deliver the software for them. Easy, streamlining things a lot. But this assumes that one department has only one purpose in some cases, and this is an oversimplification. It's not the case. So that is the thing that I was saying. Like department boundaries are good proxies, but they are not the whole story. And that's the underlying real good idea for software boundaries is independent purposes, so that the model is more cohesive around the given purpose. But it takes a couple of layers to, exploration. Oh yeah, now I see.
Good, thanks. So let's get to the next question. So how important do you think, so I think this relates to this, how important do you think it is to structure a business around bounded context, and do you think DDD can succeed in a business where this isn't the case? That probably goes into what you were just saying, Alberto.
I don't even know if we can structure a business around bounded context.
Yeah, so the first question is, what do they mean with business? Do they mean the business value, or do they mean the business structure, as in business versus IT, right?
And around the bounded context. So we are back to the definitions. We have a bounded context, but we don't have the business yet, and then we put the business around. So it's the wrong direction, not from the data, not from the departure, but from the business. So we have a business part.
So if I interpret it correctly, is when you design your bounded context, do you want the structure of the organization to follow that bounded context or not?
Yes.
How important is that? And can you succeed in a business where that isn't the case?
It feels like you don't have the power to do this. It will probably never happen, and so the business are actually surviving without this.
Yeah. such an interesting issue. It's kind of hard to talk about in the abstract, right? I mean, but certainly, I mean, I'm sure some business reorganizations are done for the right reasons. But then I'm sure there's a whole lot that are not, right? And you know, I mean, the only thought that just pops into my head is if you look at, you know, like I always think of Amazon as like an incredibly successful company, right? And as far as I know, their structure is it's a network of loosely coupled teams that are basic, you know, I think to some extent acting like mini businesses, right? And there's not a huge amount of hierarchy, right?
And that sometimes, though, I'm going to make a comment because I know some folks who used to work at Amazon. At sometimes, because of that, they step on each other's toes, but they're willing to accept that. Right?
Yeah, but to me, they're like an incredibly successful company, right? I mean, there was something. Oh, James Lewis gave a talk at Microservices Copenhagen, which was about it was based on some book Scale, and you know, like most companies, I guess as they grow, the profit or revenue per employee ultimately flattens out, right? Whereas Amazon, and that's partially because they're like a tightly coupled hierarchy, whereas because Amazon was this loosely networked organization, it was almost like the bigger they got, the more profit or more revenue per employee they made, right? Because there wasn't the overhead of having a tightly coupled organization. So it's
there still are dependencies between services, and that's what I was talking about. Where sometimes, you know, moving fast doesn't always consider all the other, you know, hidden dependencies that might exist in there, but then they work through them. So you have to have this culture of, I'm going to say, almost sort of like organic adaptation.
Yeah. But, you know, versus like tradition. I mean, I remember, you know, here's an extreme example. Years ago, I wanted to fly business class to a company, to India, right? Because there was no way I was going to fly all the way in coach.
Yeah.
Right? That decision went to like the CEO. And this is like a massive company, right? Or, you know, thousands and thousands of people. And it's sort of like those kinds of decisions should be delegated down, right? But no, in big companies, you know, brain thinks at the top, workers do at the bottom, I mean, to some extent. And, you know, that's that flow up and down is inherently slow and expensive.
Yeah, there's also that feedback loop, right? And
which one?
Consider the telephone game.
Which
going
feedback
up and down.
Yeah.
Anarchy, right, Christina?
Yeah.
So
and you get that in little ways. Oh, we have to ask the VP if I can deploy my code into production, right? What's the VP know?
Yeah. Yeah. One manager told me once, just do it and tell sorry later what's going to happen.
Yeah.
I think a lot of companies could have a lot of value for looking into beyond budgeting, for example.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, so how does a project-related culture factor into this? Because I actually think that ownership over time builds competency. And if you have projects where I'm working on this, I'm in this department, you know, working on this, and then I get pulled off because we just do project-based work based on bidding of business value. That's in some sense, you don't really build up expertise or love and care for what you're building and making as developers.
Yeah, and especially knowing that. So I recently talked a bit about when I started my first job, I thought it was normal that you get educated in the domain. So I got a asset management course for 2 days, so I understand the business more. That's why I don't trade in stocks anymore. But it made me more certain to make certain changes in the legacy because I knew what was going on and what was the process was, and I built up the compasses to talk more with my customers or
Oh, Kenny, you
users
could have been a
or
master, master.
Asset master.
yeah,
Asset
asset master. Yeah,
EJ
so
asset master.
I later found out that that's not the norm, unfortunately. But that's what, yeah. If you were pulled onto a project, then you never get that certainty that you want to deploy on Friday, which is always a huge discussion, right? But we certainly deployed on Friday because we know what the impact would be to our business because, yeah, we were part of it.
I think that's one of the greatest values of DDD, actually, is that it's all about the domain. And it's domain understanding first, technology second, right? That's not to say that technology is not important because it really is. But yeah, I mean, like you should have the right organizational structure is these small, loosely coupled product teams that are long-lived, that become experts in their respective subdomain, right? Yeah, and having someone split their time 3 ways between multiple projects with colleagues in 6 different time zones, which is, it happens in some organizations, is not conducive to success.
And I think we're back to the cognitive load on the individual level there, right? Too much context switching and that's I guess that's where the abstraction also comes in, because, well, it's what Eric says, right? That lack of knowledge create models that lack the connection with the business. I'm not sure what the exact quote was, but that lack of domain expertise that resembles back to your code, because then your code also resembles that lack of expertise eventually.
Yeah.
So let's get back to a bit of splitting up services, right? This was an interesting discussion, but Anoop here asks, how would you modernize a legacy? And we're back to databases as the key again. How would you modernize a legacy that has over 3,500 Oracle stored procedures?
I once tried to consult. I won't say what industry this was in. It wasn't Oracle, it was a Microsoft database, but it had lots and lots and lots of stored procedures. The biggest problem for those stored procedures was that they had, on the average, 100 parameters. So they're passing in the world, and they were doing a lot of behavioral shenanigans. So looking at all that stored procedure code and trying to really infer what the expected behavior and the consequences and how the hell would you have tested it. But it had been, it was brought into that industry by Microsoft consultants who loved their database, right? And said, well, you want to get close to the data to do this massive processing that they were doing. So anyway, I don't know whether the person who asked this question has that, constraint or not. But when something has that many stored procedures, there really has been a shift in the way capabilities can actually execute. And it isn't always the case that being in a database makes things go faster these days. Intelligent use of cores and doing processing. So how would I go about restructuring it? I'd want to understand what the biggest pain point is. And again, similar to, and do some experiments off to the side about how we could do things first. I wouldn't just say, oh, we need to split it up.
Yeah.
You are a hero. I would say not at all, but okay.
Well, I mean, I think it is a matter of like, well, first off, knowing what the problem is, right? And
Yeah.
I mean, you could read into it and assume is, well, we need to migrate to a microservice architecture because we need to go fast, right? But yeah, but I mean, fundamentally, it comes down to figuring out what your target architecture is, and then carving off chunks of, well, code plus stored procedures, which is just more code.
Yeah.
Yes. And it's making my head hurt just thinking about it. But and then the corresponding tables. And so it really is identifying the boundaries of as-is, like an as-is module, decoupling it from the rest of the system so that you can then move it into a service.
Yeah, hopefully it was done because there was some algorithmic stuff going on, behavioral, interesting stuff. If it wasn't, anyway, I would find it much more tedious and difficult.
Well, the odds are it goes back. I mean, that's to me like that architecture is the extreme kind of manifestation of the database-centric enterprise art culture, right? Where it's like the database is the one ring to rule them all.
We don't trust people to write database modifications, so we will do it in the database is another reason, right?
Yeah, exactly, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's a defensive architecture, but it's one where I'm sure, you know, certain companies have got extremely wealthy off promoting this database-centric architecture, right?
Mm-hmm.
In my experience, my first company, no, my second company I was working on, it was, I have worked, they were a startup 15 years ago and they had to start very fast, and it was an e-commerce company. And because of legal expectations, they had to have a PCI certification. And this certificates all the code and all the processes you are doing, but the database. So the database got really big. It was their way to go fast. They configured a lot of stuff, a lot of behavior, a lot of stored procedure. I not even get to learn all of them in 9 years because we are relying on each other. But this was a way to go fast, very fast, not have this PCI processes behind it. But how to solve this later? I don't know. So it's
so would that in 10 years be 3,500 serverless functions on AWS?
you
Wouldn't
cannot.
that be similar?
I don't think so. In my experience, this would be the way if there would be without side effects. But you are in a database. You have no idea which procedure occurs in which table, what's happening. You cannot see it anymore. In contradiction with code, you just cannot see it. My first action in this company was I changed a configuration 1, and I logged, I think, 10 tables because they was referencing each other with some stored procedures. It was one configuration from true to false. It was a terrible experience. So I understand the decision, but I don't know how to move on from there. But building it new in a bounded context, separately, not data-based, but behavior-based and anti-corruption layer, a big anti-corruption layer. The hard one.
And I think, go on, sorry.
Back to the original question, I've sort of seen the same type of setup at least 2 times. I have a similar one at the moment. And not to be too overly pessimistic, but it's going to be an uphill battle to get that thing split up. Actually, I'm feeling going back to the old Max Planck quote from science, that science progresses at one funeral at a time. I'm not saying it's that bad, but sometimes it can feel like that. It's so ingrained. It's really hard. Actually, also a company where there was a lot of stored procedures, but it also had triggers to mystify the whole thing even further. So it's going to be tough, but I think you have to start from the outside in, do some proper business modeling and do that approach, because you can't pull this thing apart as it is.
Yeah, and it's similar like the discussion we had before, right? Look at the behavior and split up. Good. So the next question is also about splitting, and it's where we left off a while ago, Trond. That was your question, right? So Parnas touches on a functional decomposition anti-pattern, which was defined in OO. How does event storming and bounded context in phases compare to that? And maybe you can explain it a bit more.
Yeah, I can try to give some context. I think it was there was a meetup in August, I think, and for me there was an ultimate cliffhanger there before you sort of signed off, where I think you went into event storming, and I think it was Nick who said that you get this linear sort of model when you do event storming, because you start with a timeline and it follows. And I remember from OO that using sort of the workflow steps as a separation is actually an antipattern. It's a functional decomposition antipattern. Also, I think that's what actually Parnas was talking about in his paper. So I was wondering, is event storming, could that risk of getting you to that same situation? I guess I would, if I should answer that myself, I guess not necessarily, because the event storming is higher, at least the big picture one. So you get to the business flows, not the workflows, if you like. So it might work, but they still feels very linear to me.
Yeah, but the thing about the workflow and the boundaries is going to be there anyway. So I have a preference for when I get into a boundary, I make a copy of the data into a new class for the next boundary. That's my kind of default attitude. I don't want to have the same maybe document structure or class moving from left to right. Also because the behavioral patterns in the different phases are different. Like a content before being published is a place for collaboration and comments and amendments and changes. The same document after being published becomes read-only and a background for other decision. It's I'm actually doing something similar to what you were mentioning, and that I put in a little drawings that I added to the mirror board. It is exactly which are the things which are changing in which areas, and yeah, instead of making it happen on the same database table or the same object, well, just make a copy. Now you're something different. Unsigned contract, signed contract, same data structure, different behavior. That's but at the same time, this is not the only coordinate. As I say, favorite pattern is a preference. It's not a rule. It also depends a lot on other people managing these things, different people. If there is a contract, unsigned versus signed, these are clearly different people. Unsigned contract is salesperson, signed contract is a person in delivery and service, so it's different people and different concerns. Okay, easy, that's a good indicator. Yeah, it's giving information, but the other part of the information is where are the people by the wall when doing the collaborative modeling. If the same person is moving left to right, touching everything, maybe they need a single model for this person for this specific purpose. If the people are in separate groups, why should they force these people to talk every single day because the data is corrupted because they're sharing a database or the same class? And so I know what my purpose on this planet is. I just want to have software developers having less meetings about shared resources. That's my goal. That's all I want to do.
It's fine. One interesting phenomenon I've observed, like, prior to COVID, I was flying a lot, half the time basically around the world. And it seems universally true that every company does not have enough meeting rooms. Which is just, it's so indicative of just too many meetings, basically.
And this is also the reason why even storming started, because I was traveling with the paper roll in my backpack because there were not enough meeting rooms. So, okay, I keep my whiteboard in my backpack and I can do modeling wherever I want. So that's a snake biting his tail.
Yeah.
And it's actually quite, if you want to improve collaboration, it's actually the best thing to do is just go to the coffee machine, roll out your, well, now it's not possible, well, then just roll it out and start modeling yourself, and people will tell you you're wrong anyway, and then you'll have a nice conversation. So to start collaboration, that's the easiest way, I think. Does that answer your question, Trond?
Yeah, well, actually, there's a little bit of a follow-up because you mentioned something interesting, Albert. You said that when you observe a person going from sort of one part of the map and then move to another and back and forth, could that be indicative? Yeah, it could, of course, be indicative of there is a big model here, but it also could be that the model is sort of split. It's not linear. That there is a feedback loop, or there is a wrap. There's another dimension that you're not seeing. That because the reason why I'm saying this is that if you remember from the 80s, you have this value chain configuration sort of thing of a company. You have some material in, they do some work on it, and then they sell it, and then they serve it. Right? That's the classical value chain. But for example, I worked in telecom for many years, and they did some studies in the University of Oslo, I think, where they come up with another value configuration, which was a value network. So instead of having a chain, you have a network, because you have what you do as a company is connecting people, basically, like a Nokia code. So it's a different configuration. And there was another one called, I think it was value shop. Like you go to the doctor, you confer with the doctor. There's no chain, there's no workflow that you go through. You discuss. So it's a different setup, if you like.
So that's interesting. Given that situation, Trond, it seems to me like a value mesh or connection is inherently more complex to model as a business to decouple.
But
exactly.
But it feels like just a matter of, can we find a projection in a bidimensional space? It's,
hopefully, yeah.
So phases is really trivial, but it's and it's wrong in many cases. But it's just a good way to trigger the conversation, because we are rooted in a way that the story has a beginning and an end. But that's easy for the conversation. Then we realize the story can have multiple beginnings, multiple ends, cycles and parallel swim lanes. Okay, a little bit more of an adjustment, moving things around and realizing, okay, they are not phases. It's something more sophisticated.
So this is very interesting. This is exactly like personas and their kind of storytelling around personas. We pick a path through it to have an interpretation of it, but we should not be lulled into thinking that it's just this linear thing. Or this is the one story. This is just the one we picked. This is the scenario we chose.
Yep.
Personas and scenarios and usability kind of things are exactly that way. We have to understand, we have to pick a path through and understand it.
Yep.
But we shouldn't think that's everything.
No, absolutely. It's just an approximation to kick off the conversation. And then, okay, we got this right. Now this more and more together. And then it's, finding a good organization in the physical space, like a wall or a mirror board. This is tricky, but solvable. Actually, easier in mirror because, people's stature is not a problem.
Now I got an answer, Kenny. That was really good, Ken. Albert,
good.
Thank you, and Rebecca.
Yeah, thanks. So going into that splitting, right? And this is a question that got asked on Meetup before, and it's one thing I get into a lot of the times when we split into multiple boundaries or into, I'm phasing out here, but into multiple microservices. What are some favorite testing strategies to ensure the new microservice does what a portion of the monolith was doing, either the same or better? So what are some testing strategies? Usually I see, we need to do an automatic end-to-end read all microservices together, test. That's what I see a lot. But what are some favorite testing strategies? Because I see a lot of people struggling, and as always, testing is always the thing that we do somewhere at the end of the project, right? Still. Sorry, that was sarcasm, but who wants to get a go at it?
Yeah. I mean, there are things, I mean, some companies, I feel like, who talked about this? I don't know if it was GitHub or Airbnb. I mean, one possibility is you run your monolith and your microservices side by side, and you can compare the results, right? Which that's kind of tricky to do. But that would be like the super secure way of making sure that it's assuming that your new service is behaving the same way as your monolith, right? Other than that, it's just a matter of, well, we know, here are the tests for our monolith. Let's have the same tests for our service, right? I mean, that's another possibility. I mean, there are challenges in the sense that some people don't even know, like, what the requirements for the monolith were lost 20 years ago.
Then you can say it works exactly similarly because it's the same, fulfills the same requirements. But I never saw that somebody is refactoring something without adding new. I don't think that this happens often, to not add any new behavior, because you finally can. You finally have some freedom. Otherwise, I would go with the same approach. Shadow linking, shadow calls to the new API. You have the same big boundaries like the monolith. The rest is implementation detail. If you didn't change anything, so the test should be the same. The results should be the same. Or shadow functionality, or how it's called, that you have the same calls to two different endpoints, and you verify if the second one has the same result as the first one. And one is your monolith, the second is the microservice. But the biggest question is, are the requirements the same? Is this really something copied and chopped in parts, or has new behavior, has new fulfills new expectations, and then the tests are not maybe not valid anymore? But can this happen, that somebody is just splitting a monolith without making it better? So implement new functionality, allow new behavior, give something for the customer, create some value beside this autonomy.
Well, you could view it as two steps, right? One is migrate functionality out into a service unchanged, right? And verify that and then, that to me, that and then enhance it.
Yeah, but
right. Because once by splitting it up and using a more sort of incremental approach, I think that, it reduces the size of the step and it simplifies the problem, right? In particular, like, you just use the same database schema that the monolith, or the same slice of the database schema that the monolith uses, and you have that in the service, right? The same columns. And then means that as an interim step, I have a presentation on this on microservices.io. The service code and the monolith could actually share the same database table, right? And work side by side. And
yeah,
well, actually, sort of the thing we have done is not to replicate or to pull out and just do the same thing as the old monolith did. So we try to modularize as part of our business chain. So when there is a business chain, there is some new functionality there, or they change some functionality or whatever, and then we pull out what we need and leave the rest behind, and don't sort of just copy it, because as somebody said, that there's a lot of history there that you really don't want to carry forward.
Yeah, and I think the bubble context of pattern described by Eric could help there as well, what you described. Okay, so shall we go to the next question? We talked earlier about the dangers of making things too flat because we're adding too much inside our model, right? It's something that we spoke about earlier. And the question here is, what's the best way to determine whether a new feature, read API, should be implemented in an existing microservice, whether a new microservice should be created for it? So when do we decide what are some heuristics there to decide, should this be inside here or somewhere else? Who wants to take a go?
One simple heuristic is who this request is coming from. I mean, if the request is coming from a different department, it smells like different capability. I mean, that's the first thing you notice. This person is not the usual one.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, like if you think about it, I mean, there's things like there's reasons to put it in an existing service, right? I mean, which could be it's conceptually similar. It sort of falls within the kind of the domain, subdomain of the team that owns that service, right? Versus assuming having it done by a separate a new team with a new service. You know, if you add it to an existing service, is it going to increase the cognitive load of the team that owns that service too much, right? And then if you put it in a different service, what's the cost of communication between the old and the new services? What are the consequences of transactions, right? Like going back to within a service, you have ACID transactions. Between services, you have eventual consistency, and is eventual consistency enough, right? But what is the nature of the communication? I think that's the key thing. And then also, I mean, we haven't really talked about this. I mean, Robert Martin, Uncle Bob, years ago, mid-90s, had his book and object-oriented design principles, right? And one of the key ones there was like the common closure principle. Things that change together for the same reason should be packaged together. So, which is all, I suppose, to do with kind of cohesion in a way, or coupling, and then so they should be put together, right? If they're going to keep changing in lockstep.
Maybe because it's driven by the business. We don't talk about the business. We are talking about the implementation decision, but it should be driven by the business. Which part of the business should be enhanced, had this feature, had this behavior, capability. This is what depends on, because otherwise I have a few or a bounded context or microservice regarding authorization. I cannot put there something regarding customers or orders because it's not belong there from the business perspectives.
Well, what happens when the business perspective says put it in this service, but the cognitive load of that service is too high for the team to manage it?
Then we should research it. Why it is something new, so big that we cannot take it anymore. We cannot handle it anymore. It means it is a smell that this is something really big and not a feature. Because it's totally new. There is already a team. There is already some business knowledge. You learned about what did you learn? Assets, or and then somebody tell you, okay, now you have to write a paper about houses or prices on houses. I don't know. It's totally different stuff. It's nothing what you already did. So why it is your job to do it.
So I have found that over time, businesses tend to get more complex. There's this law of like, the longer you're in business, most businesses, not all, but they get more complex. And so something that might have been a fixed asset these days, we now have 20 different, over time we have 20 different categories of those sorts of things. And so recognizing that, I kind of think that services are not these things that we want to keep packing stuff into, but there are times when we need to pack stuff in and say, oh yeah, that's too complicated, and just split it out. That's, Chris has been poking around with us about subdomains all the time, but that sort of complexity factor does happen with businesses over time. And we may not know that something is complex today that is, complex, will be complex in 5 years if we're successful. And so this sort of splitting is really when you feel that it's worth it's worth it to get rid of, to reduce friction, whether it be, and you do have to deal with other complexities then, like, I gotta have now eventual consistency, or there is this dependency here between these things that I split up. And I wish that life were not messy, but businesses over time just get messy. So we have to make these decisions on the spot.
I mean, I think that this growing happens at every level, right? Methods get longer, classes get bigger,
tests
get, everything gets bigger and bigger over time. And
garbage too.
Don't get me started. I'm tidying up my office now, and I'm finding things that should be in a museum. It's like I've got a collection of Sun T-shirts somewhere in my office. But no, if you think about it, right? Like you have an existing structure and you keep adding to it, right? And many of the code smells, at a base primitive level, a result from not taking a step back and realizing that you need to come up with a new structure, right? Like instead of one method, have two, instead of one, and in a sense, like an overly large monolith really is a manifestation of that, right? And then the same thing can happen with a service, right? You have a team owns a service, the service gets bigger, the team gets bigger.
Yeah, are we natural hoarders? Are we natural hoarders? No, I think complexity happens, but yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I have a hoarding problem. I do. Just
so I'm moving houses now. So I'm reorganizing everything while moving houses, and I put something into a box, and the box gets too big, and I'm like, okay, I need to split this category up into 2 categories, right? So saying, okay, this first was everything that could be glued something together, like tape or glue or kit or whatever, and now I'm like, okay, now I need to split it up somewhere.
And
so
then just lose it.
It's too big for me, too heavy.
Plus you're using the copy and garbage collector strategy, right? I'm having to do like a sort of mark and sweep in place.
Yeah.
But
what Alberto said.
It just, I think Rebecca said the word that woke me out. So I started by saying something stupid, clownish, like I just look at the people. But then the real answer is that you cannot look to only one indicator, because this is so much context dependent. And what Rebecca said pain, which is exactly the only reasonable trigger for starting to split. We feel, we just might be annoyed by models which are not perfect, but before it becomes pain, we're not going to change them. And the pain depends on the size of your organization, on the moment you're growing, and that's the only moment where you're actually applying this. But so looking for a simple answer. What is the rule? No, there is none. Just like in indicators. This complexity growing, yes. and the person might be in a small organization is the same person over and over, so it's not a good indicator. In a large one, is a completely different story, and so it's basically about feeling the pain, and also the pain is it happens earlier if you are in a large organization, because the cost of coordinating between many other people is doable. But if you are just a team of 3 people, you can do miracles in a small organization, and then it will fall over you and everything will collapse one day, but you better retire exactly before that. It's so much subjective in this case, not exactly one single rule for this.
Well, I would say though, there are some metrics, right? Like from DevOps, so there are metrics like lead time, how long does it take from a developer committing a change to that change being deployed into production, right? Which you could just, assuming, and obviously that if you've got manual steps in there, then that's something else, but assuming it's automated, right? Then it's like, how long does it take to run the tests? And obviously over time, you're writing more and more code, and the thing that you're testing is getting bigger and bigger. At some point, it's going to reach some quantifiable level of being unacceptable, right? And then related back to that is deployment frequency. And then there's some kind of deployment reliability metrics as well. And I think every organization should be tracking those, right? And actively investing in, architecture to make sure that those metrics remain healthy. Because if you don't, which sadly is sort of the default situation, you dig yourself, and you're digging yourself a deeper hole day by day, and ending up with 3,000 stored procedures and and in a system that takes 2 weeks to test, right? And so on.
And then it's like, what is one more?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. You get into this, what is one more? And so sometimes you have to take bold architectural steps, or get clever about it. Like I remember talking to someone from SourceForge where, their tests for running on all the different platforms took such a great long time that they decided, well, some of the tests could be run overnight. And some tests we have, so we, again, that's a way of managing the complexity. And then, could we be very clever at recording the state of repairing back the OS so we don't have to rebuild things, but we want to know, anyway, they could have a reverse to move things back and be more clever. And that just requires appreciating that, like we have this saying that lobsters, or frogs boiling in water, if you put them in the water and just gradually rise the temperature, they'll just, but if you,
soup,
sometimes. Is that true, by the way?
It's not true, they feel the pain. But at some point, you have to say that pain is enough, or I'm annoyed enough. And that takes actually probably, commitment to sustainability. Enough is enough, we don't like it.
It's again about boundaries, right? Yeah. What is our boundary?
Our limits.
Threshold for tolerance.
Yeah,
I mean,
our limits,
what's
exactly.
pain for somebody might be, tolerable for somebody else, but it's just like, I actually don't tolerate a lot of this, so it's
So we have sorry, go on, Chris.
Oh, I was going to throw out there, I mean, the interesting thing though is like, if you look at the book Accelerate, right, which is like the research underpinning DevOps, they have gathered evidence that suggests that in highly performing software development organizations leads to more money, more profit, and the characteristics of highly performing development organizations are X, Y, and Z, right? So if you're not doing those things, yet then, that should be a red flag, right? That your business is at risk. And that, and those X, Y, and Z are things like short lead time, high deployment frequency, highly reliable deployments into production, and a quick time to recover, right? And if you're not meeting that, you're at risk.
Yeah. And so going back to that, besides team cognitive load, we should have a team pain load, I guess, then.
Yep.
Number of WTFs.
We can we can based on those metrics that you also measure the amount of what the fucks. Yeah.
This is one of the earliest and best metrics ever.
Yeah, no, it's crude but effective, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And very transparent.
Yes. So we got 15 minutes to go. I got 2 short questions that I'd like to wrap up with. So the first one, and I would like to ask everyone to, so I think Alberto is showing something in the meanwhile. So,
I'm getting cold.
Oh, you're getting cold.
He's preparing to leave.
So the first quick question everyone can answer. First quick questions, and let's just answer these individually really quick. The first one is, what is coming after microservices? So we talked about splitting up things is something that's ages old, right? Now it's microservices, but what would be the next thing? Rebecca, maybe start with you. What do you think?
What
would be the next battle in splitting up?
I tend to think that we're going to have a more set of pattern sequences to do split up, rather than saying it depends and people will be writing about that. So will there be more technology, Lambda, serverless, nothing, whatever? I don't think there's any, magic recipe for technologies. So I think we'll just get better at understanding when to do things.
Great, thanks. Chris, what would your answer be? What would be the next thing?
Well, I think I basically agree with Rebecca. I mean, like, just this notion of splitting up into these independently deployable units, I think it's actually quite an old concept, right? Like, given Amazon did this back in 2002, and it's taken until now for the rest of us to realize that is a good thing. And interestingly, that you could argue there is a limit to splitting, because you end up splitting things that belong together just from a domain perspective, right? So so I don't think it's accurate to say that you can go to nano services, right? Because you're going to violate the common closure principle, and that you're going to have these things that should be deployed together. But yeah, then around that, I view serverless or AWS Lambda as just purely a microservice deployment function kind of thing, where a microservice has multiple REST endpoints. Each one of those is a Lambda, right? And so you're going to, kind of have maybe cooler, more lightweight deployment techniques. But I feel like from a software design perspective, there is a limit to how far you can split. Famous last words.
Thanks. Alberto.
Oh, well, all the good stuff is probably was already been said. So I have something on the sarcastic side, like the world is going to be split in 2 tribes. The ones that did microservices right and making money out of it, and the ones that ran out of budget doing microservices wrong. And I'm gonna be sitting somewhere and see what happens, because they're gonna say something like, we tried microservices and didn't work because of blah blah blah. And yeah, so let's see the two tribes. And yeah, that's all I can say now.
Thanks. Christina?
I don't know. I see it just like Rebecca. We start to learn and understand what we are just doing and make it better. Making better decisions based on real arguments and heuristics and not gut feelings and private interests, and understanding the relation between business and our software, what we deliver, or maybe we start not to deliver software but solve other ways. Think about the millions of lines of code what we are producing, and making it more thinking more about what we are doing and not just doing it.
Radical.
Trond.
Yeah. Going last is like what everybody else said, but yeah, I think services are finally here to stay. I mean, we had a go at it, copying. We tried to copy Amazon in the 2000s, didn't go that well for many. But I think we've come to the stage now that actually microservices has helped us to cross that chasm, if you like. So I think it's here to stay. But so but it's not going to replace everything. I think it's going to, like Alberto say, it's going to be, some is going to be stuck in the old and probably going to thrive in the old way of doing things, in the monoliths or whatever systems they have. While others are going to move on, maybe try some serverless and go even maybe getting closer to your non-services, Chris. At some, I don't know, but I think serverless is probably going to be the big venue for microservices going forward.
Thanks. Now, to close off today, let's do the reverse then and start with you, Trond. What's your favorite key heuristic for splitting up systems, large-scale systems?
It's not going to come as a surprise come for me, is it? Yeah, I would start with the outside-in perspective. That's sort of where I get most effects, at least. So how you do it, I like business capabilities, but that's just one go. You can do event storming like the big picture one. Try to get the outside in perspective, at least. Have the full holistic view, and then you can start splitting. Because just splitting for random wherever you are, it's risky. That there's no guarantee that the one thing that you're pulling out is the one that should end up being there in the final. So have some ideas, then some start splitting and putting them into sort of a big, not map, but a sort of a direction at least.
Great, thanks. Christina?
Oh, I just read a question here on Miro. I forgot. So my way to go is like Trond, big picture event storming, and I even work hard to not think about the rest. We are in this process at the moment, and my colleagues are thinking about what we have, and I want to forget what we have, to not have this bias, to have this big picture stories and journeys and behavior descriptions, and start only after that, and think about teams and cognitive load. Yeah.
And pain load.
And payload. This is for me. This won't work separately. We cannot say we have work for 20 teams if we have only 2 teams. So we have to decide, prioritize, and let the rest rest.
Thanks, Alberto.
Okay,
your
you
key heuristic.
Favorite. So I'm just talking about personal preference. Big picture event storming to see the pain in the problem space. Draft executable separation in the solution space. Favorite, not necessarily the best one, but yeah, the one that I enjoy most doing. Oh, it was just a flag. Yes, and create coupling. So yeah.
Thanks, Chris.
Well, you know, if you need to develop software rapidly, frequently, and reliably, you need a loosely coupled modular architecture where each, should we say, module is team-sized as defined by team topology, right? Which architecture you use, monolith versus microservices, really depends upon a bunch of factors, right? Like the scale of your size of your organization, the size of your size of the application as well. And yeah, and so if if it is in the context of refactoring, right, from a legacy system to a loosely coupled architecture, it's good to begin with the end in mind. And event storming, I think, can play a huge role in identifying what the individual pieces are. And then you're just going to focus on carving off and migrating over the pieces, for the most part, that give you the most business value. And so you just prioritize by return on investment and work your way down the list. And if you want to implement new features that are sufficiently decoupled in a microservice architecture, you can implement those as standalone services, provided they make sense as services.
Cool. Thanks, Rebecca. Last but not least.
Okay, I'll try to say something different. I think there's two things that sort of drive me into understanding splitting things up and packaging, and we haven't talked about those yet. So I'm going to say understanding your system, your business's shearing layers, and that's the rate of if you are into that, you should look at Stuart Brand's How Buildings Learn, but basically separating out things according to their rates of change and enabling the rates of change to progress so there's less friction. I'm all about sustainability of the kind of growth that we need. And so I don't expect things to be static over time, but if I understand what is changing and how, then I can use those to guide how I split things up.
Perfect. Thanks. Well, I hope these heuristics answers a bit of the questions of today for our audience and listeners. So there's still a bunch of, well, a lot of questions popping up, right? We answered one question, 5 pop up. Sorry we couldn't answer that in this 2 hours. But I hope you enjoyed everything, and I would like to thank everyone on the panel for joining this discussion. I'm going to close the YouTube session, and we're going to do a bit of after talk, a few more minutes on Zoom. We talked a bit about not going too much into defining certain stuff in DDD. That will be in 2 weeks, where we're going to check the relationship between problem and solution space and how core subdomains and supporting and generic domains relate to that. An H-code answer that's going on Twitter also for a few months now. So tune back in 2 weeks for defining that. And thank you all for joining.